Two sanctions threats hover over South Africa. One slow, the other ready to fire. I'm not panicking over Congress's sanctions bill just yet. It still has a long way to go, but don't get too comfortable. Trump could pull the trigger tomorrow. Stick around and I'll demystify potential US sanctions on South Africa, reveal who can strike first, and show exactly how soon the squeeze could start. Spread the fire. Welcome back to the Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh Experience, or SMWX for short. I'm Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh. On this channel, we explore South African politics through interviews and analysis. And in today's episode, I'm going to have a look at the threat of US sanctions on South African officials. A lot has been made because a bill passed through a congressional committee, and some South African media have been reporting it as if sanctions are around the corner tomorrow because of Congress. That's not really true. There's still a very long way for this sanctions bill to go. However, the story doesn't end there because Donald Trump still has the power to sanction anyway, and I'm going to explain all of this in this episode. So by the end, you're going to have a firm grasp of what's going on with potential US sanctions on ANC, maybe government officials in South Africa. Also, stick around because I'm going to talk about the terms of reference for the Madlanga Commission, which is the commission set up as a result of Mkhwanazi's allegations. We got those terms of reference recently. Before we start though, I just want to say, quick call to action. We're targeting 300,000 subscribers, so please subscribe. Let's get to that milestone. Watch some of our recent videos. My interview with Prince Mashele, we're trying to get that to 1 million views. So go over and watch that interview. It's already on 700,000 views, or listen to it on the podcast streaming app. And if you're watching this on YouTube, click like and subscribe and share. If you're listening on the podcast, don't forget to give us a rating. Okay, so the Donald Trump administration has, of course, had South Africa in its crosshairs right from the beginning. There have been a number of controversial tweets about South Africa's domestic policy, and the threat of sanctions has been looming as maybe the culmination of the Trump administration's policy towards South Africa. Now, very recently, US Congressman Ronnie Jackson passed a bill through the Congress, effectively foreign relations body. And this is a committee structure within the US Congress, which is kind of like the South African Parliament. And this has created a sense of panic in South African media, where it's been suggested that just because this bill has passed through a committee, it is just about to be enacted by the US Congress itself. First things first, who is Ronnie Jackson? Ronnie Jackson is quite an interesting figure and character. He was actually Donald Trump's physician, and he was a White House physician dating back to the Bush administration. Someone who has a controversial past. Let's take a look at his vehement defense of Donald Trump's health when he was the White House physician, and then we'll get into some controversy surrounding him. Effectively, he's a big MAGA movement voice.
Issues of different time zones and things of that nature too. And I'll tell you, out of everybody there, the president had more stamina and more energy than just about anybody there. And he was the one that was always like, we're not going to skip this event, we're not going to skip this, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and stuck to the schedule despite the urging of some of us to let's just forget the rest of the day.
So yeah, Donald Trump back then, the most energetic person in the room. So Ronnie Jackson is a big Trump supporter. That's who he is. He was Trump's physician in the White House. He now has a political career. Now, Jackson is no stranger to controversy because his tenure as a White House physician ended in some ignominy. An NPR report had this to say about how he left office after there was an internal investigation by the Pentagon into his role as a physician at the White House. And it said, Ronnie Jackson made sexual and denigrating statements about female subordinates. It said he smelled of alcohol while on duty and humiliated his staff during his long stint, according to this NPR report. And the report effectively was described as scathing. This also marred his political ambitions. He tried to become the Secretary of the Veteran Affairs in the US. This is effectively a key role dealing with US war veterans. And he withdrew his candidacy because of the controversy around this internal report into his time as White House physician. Anyway, of course, he denies that, but let's take a look at the way that he has framed his new act on US-South African bilateral relations. This is from a hearing in the United States Congress where he's speaking to Marco Rubio, current Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Mast, for holding this crucial hearing and allowing Secretary Rubio to highlight the overwhelming successes accomplished so far in the Trump administration. Secretary Rubio, thank you for being here today and for the incredible work that you and the department are doing. We're really proud of it. Thank you. I want to echo your opening statement. America is back. From bringing home hostages held in Gaza, initiating a peace agreement between the DRC and Rwanda, countering China's influence around the world, and much, much more, we are back. Thanks to the great work of President Trump and your great leadership, the United States is restoring its place on the world stage. No longer will the United States refuse to engage in foreign policy and diplomacy, but rather we will lead with peace through strength. I've traveled a lot recently via my various committees, including this one, throughout the continent of Africa. And one thing I've seen is that we've really neglected Africa. We have spent a lot of money and wasted a lot of money there, in my mind, with no strategic thought whatsoever into how we're spending this money. I have a question for you regarding South Africa. South Africa has withdrawn from America and our allies in recent years while increasing diplomatic relationships with our foreign adversaries, deepening cooperation with China, attacking our greatest ally, Israel, at the International Court of Justice, downgrading Taiwan's diplomatic presence, and condoning violence and race-based persecution against minorities. I fully support President Trump's executive order to bolster the administration's efforts in combating the egregious actions taken by South Africa. To support the administration's efforts, I recently introduced the U.S.-South Africa Bilateral Relations Review Act, which would conduct a full review of our relationship with the Republic of South Africa and allow for the use of targeted sanctions against corrupt officials in the African National Congress. Secretary Rubio.
Cool. So as you can see, I've dealt in many episodes about the idea that South Africa is persecuting minorities, etc. So I'm not going to go into that right now. But what I want to do in this episode, to give you some new insight, is to have a look at what this act is actually proposing. So it's called the US-South Africa Bilateral Relations Review Act. And effectively, there are a couple of important things to bear in mind. First, it calls for a 30-day presidential certification. So after the passing of this law, if it is passed, there'd be a 30-day period in which the president of the US must certify whether South Africa undermines US security or foreign policy interests. Now, just bear in mind that that could or could not be certified by the president. So the president is given 30 days to decide whether South Africa does or doesn't. Secondly, and this is quite far-reaching and sweeping, it calls for a full interagency review of every strand of the bilateral relationship between South Africa and a report to be given to Congress in 120 days. So this is quite an interesting act because it's from the legislature, from Congress, and then it's throwing it to the executive, to the president, and saying the president must look at this and then report back to Congress on some of these issues. But 120 days, so even if the act is passed, there would still be a very long time, 4 months, when reporting would have to happen. And the act hasn't even been passed yet. So there's already a 4-month deadline. So you can start to see that this urgent reporting that Congress is going to pass this bill tomorrow and it's going to affect South Africa is a little hysterical right now. But there are reasons to be genuinely worried about sanctions if you are, but we'll get there. First, furthermore, and finally, it calls for a classified list, also in 120 days, of senior South African or ANC figures whose conduct would meet the threshold for effectively targeted sanctions on those individuals. And again, I've made a video about the difference between targeted sanctions and general sanctions. General sanctions are very unlikely and would not be imposed on South Africa. But targeted sanctions hit specific individuals, potentially prevent them from traveling to the US, and in the worst case, also freeze their assets and stymie them financially, because in global financial markets, even sometimes domestic, US institutions are fundamental to the way that trade and commerce happens. So that's effectively what the Act seeks to do. Now, we need to talk about the process of how this act would ultimately become law, because we're still very far from that happening. So we need to hold our horses on thinking this is going to happen tomorrow, for example, in the way it's been reported. Firstly, we know that it has to pass through committee, which it did. It passed 34-16 in favor recently. So that's done. From the committee, it would then go to the House floor, same as in South Africa when something goes to the parliament itself, like all 400 MPs sitting there to vote on it. So that would happen, and the speaker in the US, just like the speaker in South Africa, decides on the scheduling of votes. But remember that the US has a lot on its hands. It's dealing with tariffs, it's dealing with a whole range of foreign policy issues from Ukraine to the war on Gaza. So there's a lot that's happening. And South Africa is not very high on the priority list. So there's this situation that has to come to the House floor. And there you would need a simple majority. Now, the Republican Party, the GOP, holds a majority there, but it's relatively slim. It's about, I think it's 218 or 219 to about 212. But it would be possible to pass it, particularly if they were able to rope in some Democrats, for example. But then it wouldn't stop there. And bear in mind that it takes time to schedule and pass a vote. So, it could be 3 months, could be 4, depending on how urgent. Let's assume 3, it could be 6. Sometimes things never go to the floor because they get stuck in the works and they just never end up there. So we don't know how long that could take, but it would imply at least a certain amount of time, like a few months. Then it would still have to go to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and then it would go on the Senate floor, and there are all kinds of complications about filibustering in the Senate, where a senator can stand up and talk for a really long time and delay the implementation of an act. But if you want to prevent that, then you need 60 votes in the Senate, and that would be actually quite hard to get, or much harder than just a simple majority. So effectively what I'm saying is that the US legislative process is complex, and it takes a long time to grind forward, and these US Congress sanctions are not going to be imposed. First, some people through the reporting think they have already been imposed. They're not going to be imposed next week, even if they are imposed. And there are many steps for them to be imposed going forward. So that gives you a sense. And remember, even if the act is implemented, there are lots of 120-day windows, which could mean 4-month delays before actual action takes place. Now, a further complication, of course, is that in November next year, there's an election for the US House of Representatives, and Trump and the Republican Party are not looking too good for that election. In the midterms last time, Trump lost the House. So if Trump loses the House in 2026, then we could see this act fall by the wayside completely. So it's actually really a race between whether the House falls away from the Republican Party, in my view, and MAGA Republicans, and whether, in actual fact, that happens before the act actually goes through the Senate finally, or not. So that's what we're talking here. But that does not mean that Trump cannot just sanction South Africa anyway. And that's the really interesting thing about this, because sanctions don't have to come from Congress under US law. So actually, Trump can just turn around tomorrow and be like, I'm sanctioning South African officials. So that is what those South African officials who may be worried should be worried about, because the executive power to sanction is actually quite far-reaching in the US. And we've seen that recently and in many examples. But there are various statutory instruments which allow the US president to directly impose sanctions. So one of them is the famous International Emergency Economic Powers Act. This is the act that Trump has been using to impose tariffs on other countries. I don't think he would use this act on South Africa, though, because this is about like very grave national security threats, and it's usually about countries that the US is in war against. That's why there's even a legal challenge to him using this act in the tariff context, because the tariffs he's imposing do not seem commensurate with some kind of massive national security threat against the United States. So that's working its way through the American legal system right now. But there's an act called the Magnitsky Act, and that is the instrument that if Trump were to use it unilaterally, the instrument that I think he would use, because the Magnitsky Act allows the US president to directly impose sanctions, asset freezes, travel bans, etc. I mean, there's some other stuff with the immigration where the US president can influence immigration into the US. And of course, we've already seen a cutting of aid. And then there's AGOA, which is really a combination of both the president and the Congress. So the Congress has the power not to renew AGOA, but the president also has the power to suspend specific countries, as far as I'm aware, from AGOA. And this happened with Rwanda in the textile industry, I think, recently. So they're the powers shared between the president and Congress. So there are various levers that can be pulled. And the slowest burning one is this congressional review of SA-US bilateral relations. The fastest moving ones would be Trump waking up one day and deciding, okay, I'm sanctioning South Africa tomorrow, or South African officials tomorrow. And that can happen basically at any time. The Magnitsky Act has been used on Saudi Arabian officials after the Jamal Khashoggi scandal. It's been used on certain Chinese officials. It's been used in Myanmar. So it has been used before. Add, in addition to this, the fact that there are tariffs on the table, and those are probably the biggest worry for South Africa's economy, because sanctioning a few powerful individuals is one thing, but the tariffs and the 30% tariff that has been mooted for South Africa really, in the short term, has the potential to hammer the South African economy, particularly the automotive sector, the agricultural sector, side-eye, white farmers who are supposedly being the subject of genocide. Trump is about to tariff you. So that's how much he cares about white genocide, which I find ironic. So the tariffs are the biggest thing to look at, and the deadline there is the 1st of August, which as I shoot this is upcoming. It's in a week or so. So really, tariffs are very impending. This congressional thing is probably going to take a long time and may not even come into effect before the midterms. And then the wild card is whether Trump wakes up one day and decides just to do something out of the blue, because he has the power to do that.
Ready to take your podcast to the next level? At AGOA Studios, you can film, edit, and release your podcast all in one place. From crisp visuals to clean sound, we've got you covered, and we can even distribute your podcast on YouTube and other platforms. The best part? It's brought to you by the same team that brings you SMWX quality. Are you ready to take your podcast to the next level? Welcome to AGOA Studios.
Cool. So that's a breakdown of how worried South African officials should be about US sanctions on South Africa. And this is a moving story, so we'll be there to cover it. We've done a lot of coverage of the US-South Africa spat and attempt to rebuild the relationship, and we'll continue to focus on it because ultimately it's about a really important partnership for South Africa. Right. Let's now move on to the Madlanga Commission. And this is the commission, I don't know, should we call it the Madlanga Commission or the Mkhwanazi Commission? I think it should be called the Mkhwanazi Commission because this came out of Mkhwanazi's allegations, although Madlanga is the judge now looking into them. And we got terms of reference for this commission. So I want to walk you through them so that you have a sense of what's going on with this commission of inquiry. Now, I've criticized this commission. I've rather criticized the likelihood of the South African government taking its recommendations seriously and also the timelines. But we need to look into exactly what's going on there because believe me, there will be some seriously important moments that come out of this commission in testimony. Obviously, someone like Mkhwanazi would testify. I personally think President Cyril Ramaphosa should be one of the first witnesses to tell us what he knew, what he didn't know, What actions did he take when he knew what he knew? If he didn't know, why didn't he find out? All those questions I think are pertinent. But let's have a look, because this is really interesting. So we had the gazetting of these terms of reference. It's called the Judicial Commission of Inquiry into Criminality, Political Interference, and Corruption in the Criminal Justice System, arising from the allegations of General Mkhwanazi. So, not exactly the shortest and most punchy title, but that's legalese for you. Let's look at the actual terms. So the first place we go into is that the Commission shall inquire into, report on, and make findings on whether criminal syndicates, including but not limited to drug cartels, have infiltrated or exert influence over the police, the Metro Police, Ekurhuleni Metro Police, Tshwane Metro Police, Joburg Metro Police, the NPA, any member of the judiciary, correctional services, and any other institution. So that's pretty far-reaching, and I must say they've worded these terms of reference to really get to the heart, I must say, of the allegations. Also going to look at the nature, if that infiltration exists, what's its nature and extent. Third, it's going to look into the role of senior SAPS, JMPD, various Metro Police, NPA, even State Security Agency, judiciary members, magistrates, current and former, who might have aided or abetted this infiltration if it happened, or failed to act if they knew about things. And failed to act is really important, because that's, again, what I want to put to members of the what I want to be put to members of the executive who testify, or even benefited financially or politically from the syndicate's operations. And then it's going to inquire into the role of, and get this, the role of any member of the national executive responsible for the criminal justice system, whether they were complicit, aided or abetted, or participated. Now, I have a bit of a worry. Does that include the president or the deputy president? Because it's not just about members of the national executive responsible for criminal justice, i.e. that would be like the police minister or correctional services, etc. Is this wide enough to include any member of cabinet, including the president? Because it needs to be that wide, in my view. So that's something to keep an eye on. And then it's going to do the usual effectiveness of oversight mechanisms. That basically means it's going to look at, was Parliament right? Is there enough accountability in the system to catch these things? Spoiler alert, no, clearly. And the adequacy of current legislation, should the laws be changed, etc. And then it's also going to look into whether there's prima facie evidence relating to the involvement of individuals currently employed within these agencies and what should happen to their employment status. And the Commission has various powers: the power to summon witnesses, which we know, the power to deviate from the act insofar as, we need to look at this one, insofar as public hearings. Now, this is another worry of mine, because what if a lot of this commission just ends up behind closed doors? I'm sorry, but that would be a bait and switch, because it would be like, first the president got the pressure off his back by saying, I'm going to launch a commission. And then everyone was like, okay, at least there'll be public hearings, so we'll figure out what happened. And then it's like, oh, but later it'll be like, oh, by the way, it's going to be secret. So public needs to push very hard, media needs to push very hard to make sure this commission is as open as possible to the public, and that these worries about secrecy are subordinated to the transcendental importance of public scrutiny, public transparency, and accountability. Commission has power to search and seize documents. That's interesting, subject to applicable law. I must check out where the Commission derives the power to search and seize documents. I must check the Commissions Act, because that's quite a far-reaching power for a commission, which also ultimately derives from the executive. So interesting. That's a question I want to follow up on. And then it has the power to refer these matters for urgent criminal investigation. But again, that just sounds very scary. But we know that. But it's the NPA that prosecutes, and it's the police that investigate. So those bodies ultimately are going to have to do their work and do their job urgently. Otherwise, this is going to be another document which sits on the shelf. It's going to submit its interim report in 3 months, and then now we hear it's going to be a final report in 6 months. In his announcement, the president said a second interim report in 6 months, but it can be extended, so who knows when the final report would actually be submitted. Important statements about the protection of witnesses, and also it's going to be delivered to the president, to the Speaker of the National Assembly, and the Chief Justice. What I want to know, I think we also need a commitment now that it will be made available to the public immediately, and that most, if not all of it, should not be redacted, because we don't want redacted sections. And then the question is, well, how do you make a political decision to redact sections? This needs to be made public because of the importance of the findings, and that's something that should be pushed for. So that's the terms of reference. Look, I've already issued my skepticism about this commission, but now that it's here, the public needs to make sure that we get what we need to know out of it. I'm looking forward to Mkhwanazi's testimony. I'm looking forward to seeing who the evidence leaders are. And I'm looking forward to senior politicians, Senzo Mchunu, the president, deputy president. I'm looking forward to police commissioners, all testifying before the nation and unraveling this web. In a recent analysis episode, I looked at the way that DJ Sumbody's killing and the case around DJ Sumbody has opened this Pandora's box even more. So this story is one of crime, one of intrigue, one of political power, one of people pulling puppet strings in the background, and South African citizens not being let into the picture. And this picture needs to be made clear to South African citizens. And if it is made even 50% clear, it's going to cause and send shockwaves across South Africa's political system. The ANC may never be the same again. This presidency may hang in the balance. And this could all kick off as early as August. So we await the announcement of the start date of the commission. And as you know, SMWX will be right there to analyze all that happens. Cool. Just a reminder, take us to 300,000 subscribers. Watch the Prince Mashele episode. Watch the the Malesela Tefo interview, and watch the end of that interview for our debate on whether he's a registered advocate or not. And make sure that if you're listening on the podcast, give us a rating. If you're watching, head over to podcast channels, because we're climbing up the charts there, and help us climb up the charts by subscribing on podcast channels as well. It's been a joy to be with you again. Thank you for joining SMWX, and we'll see you on the next one. Aye.
Na, na, na.